What happens when rebels start to fight back against imperialism? An allied force of 8 nations comes in to stop it. One of the biggest crossovers in history that would make Infinity War look puny in comparison. The Boxer Rebellion. Welcome to Histories and Mysteries episode 3. Today we have a little bit of a longer one, and this is covering an entire event, so I'll try to do my best with it. So sit back and enjoy. The Boxers originally came from the Shandong region of China. The name Boxer was given to them by Christian missionaries who observed their martial arts fighting. The Boxers grew in numbers rapidly. Many of them considered themselves to be impenetrable to Western weapons, and several wanted to join the fight against the imperialist nations. They claimed that they could survive gunshots and stab wounds and that armies would come and assist them from the heavens. Many of the Boxers sympathized with the group called the Big Sword Society, which is a very funny name, because they were in a group that would attack Catholics in China. Bandits would fight and usually lose against the Big Sword Society. The society would claim to be Catholic in order to get away with the murders. However, they would eventually become victims of Catholic lawsuits, which resulted in the Big Sword Society burning Catholic villages. So, there are a lot of Chinese names in this, and I'm certainly not the best at that. I have no experience in Mandarin. I remember I said like, Ni hao ba, which like, you know, how are you, to one of my Chinese classmates, and he was like, your tone is awful. I'm like, okay. So I'm so sorry for all the pronunciation that's gonna happen here, but this will happen many times, by the way. The provincial leader Yu Jian did not like where the Big Sword Society was going and ended up executing many of them. Different leaders of Boxer groups wanted to restore the Qing dynasty to a more traditional sense. They considered Christians to be priority enemies and converts to be secondary enemies. In 1897, armed bandits killed 2 priests in a German church in Shandong. Kaiser Wilhelm sent an army to the area. He had the intention to control the entirety of the Shandong area. After this, many other European countries and Japan did the same in trying to find international territory in China to claim and control. Germany was able to profit from the mining and rail business in Shandong. In 1898, Boxers attacked a Catholic church that was converted from the Jade Emperor Temple. Boxers by this point had started to gain some notoriety and had their first clash with the Qing army at the Battle of Sunulo Temple. The Boxers called themselves the Militia United in Righteousness with the slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigners." The Qing government was also being influenced by missionaries and foreign powers to abide by their agendas. The Qing dynasty didn't do much to stop foreign intervention or people from being harmed from the Boxers. Empress Dowager Cixi, again, here we go with that, had started to sympathize with the Boxers, which many foreign nationals despised. Boxers had started to make their way towards Beijing, killing missionaries, converts, burning churches and houses along the way. In response, many foreign countries sent armies and navies to protect their interests in Beijing. A group of Boxers stormed the Yongding Gate, which was controlled by the Japanese, and killed the secretary of the Japanese legation. Kaiser Wilhelm actually asked the Ottoman leader Abdul Hamid II to stop Chinese Muslims from participating as well. He sent a crew in order to do so. However, they took so long that by the time they actually got there, the rebellion was already over. Several smaller skirmishes occurred, killing many different Christians and Boxers. The British and some other countries sent a force under Vice Admiral Edward Seymour under what was called the Seymour Expedition to back up defenses in Beijing. From Tianjin to Beijing, the rail network had been cut off by the Boxers. They had fixed some of the rails but had to stop because of a destroyed station. The rails ahead and now behind them had been cut off by the Boxers, as well as the Gansus, which are the Chinese Muslims. They attacked the battalion at the Battle of Langfang. The Boxers actually won against the Europeans. They retreated and were pelted by Chinese artillery. The Europeans hadn't actually thought to bring any artillery themselves, as they didn't expect this strong of an army to go against. Seymour tried to continue his efforts, but was met with more resistance. While moving wounded and supplies, they found a huge arsenal of weapons and rice that belonged to the Chinese. They immediately took hold of it. Eventually, other battalions were notified of Seymour's position, and the battalion was rescued, after destroying the munitions that they had found. Empress Cixi had tried to find a diplomatic way to get rid of the foreigners and deal with the Boxers, but at this point, she knew it was impossible. The rural support for the Boxers was too strong. The Allied armies began to march from Tianjin toward Beijing and offered an ultimatum to Cixi. Cixi refused the ultimatum, claiming that they were probably going to lose anyway, and so she might as well go down fighting. This began the siege of Beijing. Cixi wanted the legations to leave Beijing and claimed that the diplomats of the legations would be escorted out by the Chinese military. The diplomats refused because they were afraid that they would be killed. A German diplomat was so furious that he was being told to leave, but on his way to the palace was killed by a Manchu captain. This left foreigners, diplomats, and Christians horrified, and they all hid in the British legation. On June 21st, Chiji declared war on the Allies. However, Chinese forces in the south, which were modernized, refused to fight, and instead made negotiations with the foreigners and tried to focus on the problem of the Boxers. The Chinese and the Boxers worked to siege Beijing to get the legations to leave. One of the operations set up by the Allies was an old muzzle-loaded cannon nicknamed the International Gun. This was because the barrel was British, the cartridge was Italian, the shells were Russian, and the crew was American. This is why I like this whole thing, because it's like all these different countries in one, and this is just like a great example of that. The Chinese tried to set fire to the legations to lure them out, but this was ineffective. An ancient library did catch fire, and several very old and important books were lost, and both sides were blamed for the fire. But because the fires weren't working, the Chinese forces started to close in on the legations, but no full-on attack despite the much higher numbers. The Germans and Americans occupied the Tartar Wall, which was a big fortress. Eventually, it was overrun by the Boxers. After the Americans and Germans had been expelled, American Captain John T. Myers gathered a group of British, Russian, and American soldiers to attack the fortress at night. Only 20 Boxers were killed, but the rest had been expelled. The Boxers never came back to retake the fortress. On July 13th, the Italian and Japanese forces were on their last defense, and a mine had pushed the French and Austrians out of their legations. But a few days later, the Chinese declared an armistice. This was likely because 20,000 more foreign soldiers had just landed in China. The Manchu general Ronglu, I'm so sorry, thought of the siege as futile and ordered a retreat. He refused to allow artillery to be brought to the siege. He gave food to the diplomats and encouraged the foreigners to be protected. He also had his bannermen fight against the Gansus to get them away from the legations, and were met with resistance. A decree was sent to General Nie, which was an order to stop fighting Boxers. Ronglu hid this order and had Nie continue to fight the Boxers. And so, Nie was blamed for attacking the Boxers when he wasn't supposed to, and so he got in some big trouble. He killed himself by walking into the gunfire of the Allies. Chiji ordered the legations to be protected. Boxers ended up looting the legations and were kicked out. Qing, Gansu, and Boxer soldiers roamed the streets, and everyone was confused about what they were supposed to be doing. The Boxers wanted to continue the siege. Foreigners were afraid of who was their enemy, and so they fired upon anyone who didn't seem trustworthy, including civilians. The armistice was broken once the large army started approaching Beijing. The Chinese then continued the siege, but was hindered by the influx of the foreign soldiers. The massive force also claimed many Chinese warships and took control of the Dagu forts in Tianjin. One of the foreigners rescued from Tianjin was a mining engineer by the name of Herbert Hoover. You might have heard of him. The Battle of Tianjin would end up being the bloodiest battle of the rebellion, with over 700 casualties. The march of the alliance up to Beijing was harsh. Little resistance was met, but the majority of the harshness came from the weather and the insects that stormed their pathways. Many wandering soldiers were killed by the Chinese. Both sides committed very atrocious acts towards each other. The Allies would kill civilians, mostly by Russian Cossacks, and they would disfigure bodies. The Chinese would torture prisoners, mostly Russians. The British were the first to make it to their legation. The Americans were close behind, and scaled the walls of Beijing, which was a very infamous part of the Boxer Rebellion. Russia was worried about the Japanese expansion into Asia and decided to take advantage of this situation by taking Amur and other parts of northern China. As they advanced farther into China, more and more Boxers were fought with, and were relocated or killed. Eventually, Russia took control of all of Manchuria, which would be a reason for the Russo-Japanese War later on. In northern China, many Chinese Christians and missionaries were killed. The Taiyuan massacre killed up to 2,000 Chinese Christians. The Allied occupied areas of China were pillaged and cleansed of banner and Boxer activity. Britain and America were appalled by the treatment done by the Germans, Russians, and the Japanese on the Chinese. Many were killed with no mercy and with no regard for background, gender, or age. Looting was done by everyone, though. Manchu people had fled, but many of them were killed by the Russians and had their property stolen. British observers were ashamed to write about the atrocities, as it could put Europeans in a savage light. Empress Chiji was angered by the defeat, but was glad to see that China was more or less still standing. The Boxer Protocol was signed as a peace agreement. China had to pay 450 million tiles of silver, which is equal to $61 billion today, to the Eight-Nation Alliance, which was eventually paid off in 1940. Some missionary stations demanded compensation for their losses, while others refused to take money as to show meekness to the Chinese. This was Europe's last major venture in China, as they found it much easier to deal with the Qing government rather than with the people. This left Japan as the major threat to China, which would be seen in the upcoming decades. Chiji made many reforms to the country to mirror European styles by implementing universities, police, and taxation policies. The nationalists in China had started to gain notoriety and power, and were able to overthrow the weakened Qing government 10 years later, marking the end of the dynasties of China. Many later Chinese officials would praise the Boxers for their bravery to stand against the aggressors and fight for their freedom against Western tyranny. Leo Tolstoy and Mark Twain both thought of the Boxers as patriots who were simply fighting for their country. Lenin was ashamed of the actions and pillaging that the Russians committed. In China today, the revolution was thought of as brave patriots fighting against Western tyranny, but failed due to lack of camaraderie. A Zhongshan University professor was angry at the portrayal of the Boxers as patriotic, claiming that they were violent and not people to be remembered well, and instead to be taught in maybe a more neutral way at least. And he was considered a traitor for that. I first heard about this story a few years ago and was like more into like European history and that kind of stuff, and I was like, yeah, the Europeans are gonna show those rebels who's boss. But now I'm like, oh, they were kind of the bad guys in this situation. They did not do some good things. Now, of course, like, some of them weren't as bad, but, you know, an aggressor is still an aggressor. And I don't agree with, like, the tactics of the Boxers with them killing Christians, but, you know, the alliance wasn't that much better. In fact, I respect the effort of the Boxers to stand up against their oppressors, even if I don't agree with the way and how they opposed it. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. This was quite a bit. This one took a little bit more research. I don't know if the next one will be shorter or not. I have no idea. Obviously, it's going to be a mystery. I don't even know what it is yet. I haven't decided. If you're still watching, which I don't think anyone's still watching this right now. Hi, me rewatching the video. If you are still watching this, you should comment, wow, what an awful way to show such a divisive and sensitive event. Great job, white boy. Anyway, until next time.